Excellencies, and thank you so much for joining us. Now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has really united Europe on a common cause and fast-tracked NATO membership for Finland and Sweden. In fact, we saw Finland joining 2 weeks ago. Now, the solidarity is actually being tested by the heavy cost of a protracted war. So to try and piece all of this together, we have 30 minutes, and I urge a lot of questions from the audience as well to see what's the best way forward for Europe diplomacy, and can Europe really satisfy both its economic needs and its security imperatives. So thank you both for joining us. Madam President, let me start with you. This is one of the most complicated issues, of course, that the world has been facing for the last 30 years. How long do you see Europe and its allies continuing to provide support economically through weapons to Ukraine?
Good morning, everyone. To answer your question very simply, we're in for a long haul. Right now, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, has turned into a war of attrition that has more or less become frozen in terms of the gains of either side. It's a war of attrition of Ukraine's resources, both human and technical military resources, and it's a war of attrition of us, of our own will to support Ukraine in order to spread war fatigue and to try to break our unity, which is more important than ever. Now, sending messages from the transatlantic community that we will stand with Ukraine and support Ukraine for however long it takes are good to boost morale. But I also think that we need to be a lot more specific in terms of the ways that we are going to assist Ukraine to prevail in this war militarily, and for Ukraine to remain a sovereign and independent state, which is the preposition of any future peace talks. And looking towards the end of the war, it should be a crucial part of any peace agreement. All wars end in peace negotiations. Right now, I don't see any genuine motivation on either side to sit down at the negotiating table. So the weeks and months ahead of us, where either side would have to gain the military momentum for Ukraine to be able to demonstrate that they can continue to win the war, and for Russia on their side to be able to demonstrate that they can fight back and not be defeated. The military momentum will define the immediate future and the way that we will continue to support Ukraine. However, we need to step up the quantity and the quality of military assistance and all other assistance to Ukraine in order for them to be able to make major gains.
But Lord Darroch, do you worry actually that domestic politics are starting to intervene in certain European countries that makes it more difficult to continue this kind of support?
I do. I mean, I agree basically with everything that's been said so far. I think there are some outliers like Hungary, but Western unity has hung together better than many would have expected through this phase. I think 420 days so far since the Russian invasion. And as long as the Ukrainians are doing well, I think Western support will remain solid. If you want to worry about it, and diplomats used to be paid to worry about things, if it starts to look later this year, I mean, we're in the middle of a sort of Russian offensive. I think there is a Ukrainian offensive happening probably starting in May. If it's starting to look like a stalemate by the end of this year and neither side has really made decisive progress, I would worry then about whether European governments are prepared indefinitely to continue with the three strands that are costing them quite a lot. Higher prices for fuel and for food, the cost of looking after several million Ukrainian refugees, and the cost of supplying the Ukrainian armed forces. And without Western support, Ukraine couldn't fight a week, I don't think. So that is absolutely crucial. I wonder about American politics next year and whether President Biden, assuming he runs again, which I think he will want to go into the election fighting another, what looks like a forever war. So I do think there is potentially a time limit on how long you can guarantee Western support. I think it's essential that Ukraine succeeds, that Russia is essentially defeated, though quite how you define defeat is another conversation. But I'm not absolutely confident it can last it can last indefinitely. And I agree very much with the President that I don't see any prospects for a diplomatic solution in the short to medium term. Neither side, I think, is interested in negotiations at this stage. Maybe towards the end of the year we'll see, but not yet.
And we'll look at the outcome in just a second. But if you look, Madam President, at the grain transit rules, and it's unclear as an outsider to really try and understand what are the turning points. If backing away from maybe some support from Ukraine is because economically some countries will feel that they don't get enough, does the change in support to Ukraine actually shift in the coming year?
I think what's most important in all of this is that most of the world, looking at the UN General Assembly resolutions, has condemned the attempt to change borders by military force, territorial aggression. So we need to protect the postulates of international law, of state sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity. However, looking into the future, we will be looking also into this information warfare. And disinformation warfare, and trying to affect the audiences on either side. The Russian goals are certainly to break the morale of Ukrainians to fight. And we've seen these disinformation operations, especially in the east of Ukraine. Well, we've seen decades and years of operations, but now in the east of Ukraine, you have what Ukrainians are calling waiters, people who are not ready to evacuate certain areas because apparently they're waiting for Russian forces to be able to occupy the areas and then work from within to support Russia's cause. On the other hand, Russia is also trying to influence our own information space and to break down our will. So we were quite lucky that last winter was relatively mild, so we did not pay a high price in terms of energy. But weaponization of energy, of food, of grain, of even people, refugees, trying to drive people out of Ukraine and to put an additional burden on the countries in the European Union and elsewhere, are designed to make people, the public, think, okay, is this war really worth fighting for? And this is why it's crucial to change that military momentum for Ukraine to prove that they can indeed win this war. But I honestly believe, in spite of the differences that we see, especially within the European Union, I think those are minor differences. We have basic unity in supporting Ukraine to provide for self-defense, because they are the side who are defending themselves and defending their territory. The war is not being fought on an inch of Russia's territory, and this is what the whole of the world should be aware of, even those who claim that they're neutral in all of this. And also in taking care that this war does not escalate, not territorially, and not to escalate in different domains from traditional warfare into the RCBN dimension, potentially. But what we have to look at and what we have to prepare seriously for is not just the war that is being fought in terms of territorial domain of land, sea, and air, or water and air, but we have to look at multidimensional operations and capabilities of building our cyber capabilities, capabilities to fight disinformation, but also the fact that in today's world, what traditionally used to be thought of as instruments of soft power, such as investment, trade, etc., are becoming part of the hard power arsenal.
But to you both, and you've dealt with Russia, you've dealt with Vladimir Putin himself closely. When he threatens nuclear war, do you believe him?
Well, that is really dangerous talk, because a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. That has been said so many times before. And I think that even China is very concerned about that, and that China has actually been putting pressure on Russia to de-escalate from that type of warfare. However, we've seen escalation in this war that I don't think that there is a realistic potential possibility of going nuclear, but we cannot exclude any options, because as we've seen from the documents that were leaked just recently, the potential for error in this war is very high. That could potentially escalate the war that we see in Europe, and that certainly has global consequences.
Lord Darroch, you were National Security Advisor under David Cameron for the UK. I mean, what's Vladimir Putin's endgame here?
I mean, he's already changed his objectives. It was clear at the outset that he was expecting his forces to sweep into Kyiv within a couple of weeks. The story is that the Russian soldiers had even packed their dress uniforms for their victory parade through the city. And he's now retreated to annexing those 4 provinces, that region in the east in the Donbass. But even there, he only controls a portion of that territory. So he's backed off quite a lot. I think he would now argue that if he can actually gain control over all of that area in the east that he claims now as Russian territory, plus Crimea, plus the land bridge to Crimea, he would call that a success. He would claim that he had protected all of the, what he would describe as ethnically Russians in that region and historically reclaim Crimea. But if he doesn't get at least that, I do question whether, although he is highly protected in the Kremlin, he has an entourage of ex-KGB people around him, he's very hard to get to. I would question whether unless he can actually deliver that, whether he can survive in the medium term as Russian leader. Because every day in which the famed Red Army fails to actually deliver the victory that everyone was expecting must be humiliation for them, for his generals, and for him. So I think he's in quite a tight spot at the moment.
Can I just add to that? For Putin, this is really an existential issue because the descent that we see in Russia is not going in the direction that we would want to see it, and that is opposition to the war. It's actually dissatisfaction with the way that the war has been fought, that Russia has been losing rather than winning this war. And so far, Putin has been very skillful to shift that blame from himself onto the military leadership. But it really is a question of time when things are going to change and when other people in Russia, who are not necessarily better options, will start to question Putin's leadership. So right now, he has to really solidify what his gains in Ukraine. But let's make no mistakes. Any attempt at peace talks is directed at securing the current gains and then preparing for the next step. So even when we get to the point when we talk about a post-war Ukraine, we still have to talk about dealing with a Russia who will continue to harbor imperialistic and expansionist desires for as long as we have the current structure of leadership.
And is that getting worse also because of the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO?
Well, I think that was actually a big blowback for Putin. He wanted less NATO and he got more NATO. It's not just the 1,340 or so kilometers of additional border with NATO, but it's the Finnish armed forces who are so well trained and motivated, and the fact that Finland has a history with Russia of wars in the 20th century, of having lost territories and having been highly motivated to continue to defend their territory. So the accession of Finland and ultimately Sweden to NATO strengthens both Finland and NATO and Sweden at the point. And once Sweden accedes as well, we'll have about 96% of the European territory actually being under NATO protection and the protection of Article 5.
I want to go to a poll, and then I'll come to you with actually a comment on this, and then the question on the poll. So the poll question, and I urge everyone to actually, through the QR code, answer it, because it's a good question. The most enduring legacy, we're asking, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be, and you have multiple choice, A, a stronger NATO and EU, B, Russian dependency on China, so we'll get onto China second, and 3, C, the rise and new world powers in India and the Middle East. So whilst you're actually answering that, and it settles a little bit, how would you answer this, Lord Darroch?
Well, I think that NATO is having a good war so far. I think that that Sweden and Finland joining, as has been said, is a huge advance for NATO. Really, really significant, and something Putin cannot possibly have calculated for when he launched this. So that is really important. And NATO so far has stayed really solid on all this. It's been very well led, I think, by Jens Stoltenberg. On the question, though, Russian dependency on China is also very interesting because Russia is deeply dependent now on Chinese support for them in this war. I don't think the Chinese are supplying significant levels of military equipment yet. They might still, but all of the political support in the UN and internationally has been very important. And the Chinese have taken some of the developing world with them in at least a more neutral position on this, even though territorial integrity, you would think, would be a very important principle in the rest of the world. But the relationship between Russia and China has changed. In the old days of the Soviet Union, China was the junior partner. Now Putin goes to Beijing as a supplicant almost. It must be hugely humiliating for him the way he has to do this. But China believes that this is its century and has got Russia in a different place now, basically as the junior partner.
A reminder to everyone, you can also submit questions actually through the QR code. So we know that this is not the way that Vladimir Putin thought the war would go, but what are we underestimating him on?
What are we underestimating?
Vladimir Putin on.
Well, I think we are... The thing about Putin, and actually if you look at Russian history, the thing that they have a tradition of, is he's prepared for the long haul. And he will guess, he will believe, his people will be telling him that the West might look solid at the moment, but it's not going to last. And that sooner or later, countries will start to peel off, that people will start to put pressure on Zelensky and the Ukrainian leadership to do a deal, any deal, because the costs of the refugees and fuel prices and supplying Ukraine is getting too high. So don't let's think that Putin wouldn't be prepared to do this for years and take whatever casualties, because the Russians are taking much, much higher casualties than the Ukrainians are necessary eventually to win. This guy, if he can stay in power, can really try to outlast us.
Madam President, what do you think the most enduring legacy of this invasion will be?
Well, I do agree that in the immediate and medium-term future, it's strengthen NATO and the transatlantic relationship, and we really have to stick to that because that is the basis of our mutual defense, not just of Europe, but of the United States. This isn't just about a military campaign in Ukraine. This is about war in different domains, such as energy, disinformation, and this is actually a global fight for the value system and for the world order of the future. So yes, the United States is affected, and the United States cannot think that isolation from this war could bring long-term stability and prosperity for the U.S. But looking at the second aspect, Russia-China, I think this is crucial. China does not want to see Russia defeated and humiliated. However, I think that honestly, President Xi is enjoying the current situation where Russia really has become the junior partner to China. And from the Champions League, they descended into the junior leagues. We have to remember Putin's manifesto when he came to power in 1999-2000 to restore Russia's greatness as the basis of being a great state, so territorial space, economic power and standing in the world. And with this huge blunder of invading Ukraine openly, and we can talk about the reasons and the misconceptions that figure into that, he's actually destroyed what he wanted to leave his legacy for the world to restore that Russian empire, that kind of thinking. So Russia, I don't think they will step into the domain of transferring lethal aid to Russia. I think they'll be very careful not to find themselves under sanctions, etc. But they will certainly use this to their advantage. And also, please look at the latest information that the U.S., I think, has released just recently, that Russia has really been investing China a lot into their nuclear capabilities. So combined Russian-Chinese nuclear capabilities, and for Russia, the nuclear force is still the biggest deterrent against the West or anybody else. The combined force could really pose a threat to the rest of us.
So given what we know, Lord Darroch, March 2023, actually April 2023, what's the right way for the US and Europe to deal with China?
I think we need to continue, first of all, it's a good thing that both European leaders and I'm sure senior American figures are continuing to talk to China. Although I did wonder about some of the things President Macron said when he emerged from those meetings with Xi, 6 hours of meetings with Xi, but it's a good thing we continue to talk to China, provided we send across a consistent and tough message about the way things have to evolve in Ukraine and about the mistake that I think China has made in backing what Russia is doing, given that Chinese principles also involve territorial integrity. Where we get to by 23, which would be a relative success, I think, would be if China has not started supplying any significant quantities of weaponry to Russia, if China has continued to say that there must be no thought of any conceivable use of nuclear weapons of any time, and if they are still in a relatively neutral position, what they claim their public position is on the whole thing, and if by then Ukraine has captured a significant amount of territory back from Russia, and we're starting to get to a position where it's possible to imagine some sort of diplomatic process starting up.
Madam President, how do you think we should deal with China?
Well, there are certainly areas where we have to talk to China. One of them being, for instance, climate change. And, thinking about the immediate threats to our security in Europe because of this war, we cannot forget that climate change continues, and that, to me, is one of the weapons of mass destruction. So that is certainly one of the areas where we have to talk about. Now, looking at China's peace plan for Ukraine, which is more of a geopolitical statement than an actual peace plan, there are 3 important positive elements that we can talk about. First is condemning any potential or any talk of a nuclear option. So nuclear balance and safety in the world, nuclear being a deterrent, but never ever used, because that would mean the end of the world. Second is the protection of civilian population, where I think China can do a lot to put pressure on Russia to not hit civilian infrastructure. And the third aspect is precisely the reinforcement of the principle of state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, which we have all provided actually to Ukraine and through the Budapest memorandum. Where Ukraine gave up on nuclear weapons, which could have been a deterrent against this aggression, in exchange for security guarantees and recognition, including from Russia. Those are the principles that we have to proceed on forward. However, of course, we also have to be mindful, again, of our values and the value system and the world order. And we have to absolutely protect them in Ukraine and in the rest of the world, because any backing away or any kind of a weak attitude that we displayed back in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea is sending the wrong message that, our collective will is not strong enough. So we, therefore, will not resist any attempt at trying to wage a war against our values and our institutions.
It seems that sanctions are actually the weapons of choice by the West. Will that continue?
Yes,
Have they worked?
And I think that sanctions are working, honestly. Everybody's saying, yes, immediately. Russia has been making money still on selling crude, they haven't really broke Russia down and stop the war, but that wasn't the intention. But Russia is hurting badly from the sanctions long term. And I can tell you one thing from my conversations with Putin when I was president of Croatia. Just to cut a long story short, we didn't even discuss NATO enlargement that much, which was one of the pretexts for this invasion. We didn't even discuss much the fact that openly in our press conferences I would support Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, etc. What hurt him most was energy, and the fact that I supported the building of the LNG in Croatia. And the amount of time that he spent in trying to persuade me not to build that LNG goes to show how important energy and the economy is for him. So having lost the EU as the biggest market for Russia, it certainly must hurt.
I have some great questions, so thank you so much for sending them in. Lord Darroch, if the West gives up on Ukraine, does that raise the chances of a China invasion of Taiwan?
My short answer to that is yes, maybe it does. I think the Chinese are watching what is happening in Ukraine. They're watching Western moves and Western solidarity very closely. And if we fail to last the course, if we start to fall apart at some stage in the next 12 months, just because we can't take the costs and the pressure, then I think China will draw conclusions from that about the likely reaction should they go further than they've done already, on already bullying and intimidating and behaving aggressively towards Taiwan. And of course it's a long-term objective of President Xi's to reunite China and Taiwan. Yes, they would draw some lessons from that.
Do you agree?
Well, certainly it would be my wishful thinking to say I should hope not. But yes, this is a huge test case that will have lessons learned for everyone, for us, for China, and for anyone else in the world.
Madam President, do you truly believe, this is a question to you, that NATO would be prepared to enact Article 5 if Russia strikes a member state?
I do believe so. I do believe so. And I do believe, looking at Croatia, I used to say a lot that had Croatia been a member state of NATO at the time of aggression against Croatia in the 90s, it would never have happened. And had Ukraine been a member of NATO, I don't think that this kind of open aggression of Russia's would have happened. And I think that the 2014 incursion that started this whole process would have been stopped or prevented altogether.
Lord Darroch, what are the prospects of a Russian victory?
If it goes on for a long time, if the performance of the Red Army now so far has been abject. They have been tactically inept, they've been strategically, seem to have no idea. Morale is very low, their equipment has been shown up to be nothing like as good as we expected. And the generals, clearly their leadership has been very poor. One imagines that they can learn the lessons of this disastrous first year and they can get better. The big advantage they have over Ukraine is they're a much bigger country with potentially a much, much bigger army, so they can keep, and they are, throw more people, albeit ill-trained recruits, and into the war. So if it lasts a long time, you worry a bit that in the end they can wear Ukraine down. But so far, they've just done, and this new offensive this year, where they no doubt hoped to make kilometres, they're making metres, if anything. So it's still going badly for them, even though they're on about their fourth leadership with Gerasimov.
Madam President, a final word. What do you think are the chances that Russia actually wins this?
I don't think so. I don't think so. Ukraine has shown that they have incredible motivation, that they are a nation and strong national feelings, that they're determined to fight and to protect not just Ukraine, but our own value systems. And they have shown incredible competence. Yes, the human resources are exhaustible in Ukraine. Most of these people have been fighting for more than a year. I do see that they're getting tired. A lot of experienced war veterans are now not there any longer for different reasons. And yes, Russia is compensating lack of quality with quantity, with the number of troops and the number of missiles that they fire onto Ukraine. But if we continue to support Ukraine with technology for which they have proved that they're so skillful in using and adapting, they have become the most experienced combat force in Europe and probably globally. So I do believe that Ukrainians are not just determined, but capable to fight to the end and win this war.
Thank you both for a very interesting panel.
Thank you.